Wonderful. Okay, well, welcome everybody to our next seminar. For those that don't know me, I'm Lindy Lumsden. I'm the science leader at ARI, and Fern is at an executive workshop all day today, so unfortunately she can't be with us, so I'll be sort of chairing the session. And so first I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands of which we're all variously meeting. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their elders past and present and their deep connection to country. So today we've got two fantastic botanically focused presentations, and without further ado, I'd like to hand over to ARI's own Steve Sinclair, who's going to be talking about some really fascinating work where they got invited to Mongolia to work with local graziers to integrate ecological knowledge and local knowledge to look at sustainability practices. So I'll hand over to Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindy. Hi, everyone. Yes, so I'm going to talk to you about overgrazing issues on the Mongolian steppe, and then I'll talk about the work we did using a Cashmere certification and labelling scheme to try and help the problem. And I should just mention why on earth we're working in Mongolia. As Lindy said, we've done some sort of similar work here in Victoria, and so on the back of that, we were invited through a contract to go and help some collaborators in Mongolia. So before I go any further, I'll just acknowledge that this has been a really collaborative project with quite a lot of partners. So with me at ARI, there's been Matt, Horlo and Canran, but also people from Wildlife Conservation Society, which is a US-based NGO with a presence in Mongolia, and AVSF, which is a French agronomic NGO, again with a very long presence in Mongolia. In this talk, I'll do four things. So I'll firstly introduce you to the steppe ecosystem, because it'll be unfamiliar, I think, to many of us. Then talk a little bit about nomadic pastoralism and how that works. Then I'll talk about some of the issues of overgrazing and what they're like and why they happen. And then lastly, I'll talk about our work. And without further ado, so that is a map of Mongolia, which is in Central Asia, so between Russia and China, and that shows the rainfall gradient across the country. So because of the rain shadow of the Himalaya, which are to the southwest of that image, basically the further southwest you go in Mongolia, the drier it gets, and it gets really dry. So you can see that the annual rainfall in those red areas are less than 50 mil a year. And then as you go further north, you end up with rainfall a little bit more like Victoria's. And of course, that has a big effect on the vegetation. So the area that we worked in is roughly within that black oval shape. And I've just chucked a couple of photos of some example sites on there showing how that rainfall gradient changes the vegetation. So on the top left is a site right in that kind of bluey green area where the rainfall is kind of 200 or 300 mils a year. And at that point, you're right at the edge of the northern boreal forest. So where I'm standing there, sort of up to my right is a forest of larch and pine trees, and down to my left is the tree line, and then it turns into open grassland. The top right photo is sort of near the tree line, where you've got sort of a shrubby, quite diverse, more moist steppe. And in the bottom right is what's roughly called a moderate dry steppe, which is very much treeless grassland. And on the left is a true desert ecosystem where the grasses have kind of dropped out, and it's really arid drought tolerant shrubs. And there the rainfall's about 50 to 100 mil a year. I'll just show you a few other photographs of these systems just to give you a feeling for what it's like. So again, that's a photograph sort of looking from the tree line out into the steppe. And the tiny white dots that you can see in the kind of middle distance are the gers or yurts of nomads. Another photo, very typical view of steppe. And that's a close-up of the steppe. So it's a grassland, much like our grasslands here, a range of grasses and lots of little forbs and wildflowers in between. And that's a pretty good, healthy-looking steppe, that one. A few more photos. There's one of our camps in much drier conditions. And finally, this is a system called semi-desert, so sort of a stone plain with very low rainfall. And lastly, another example of what's called true desert, where the grasses have dropped right out and it's just a few shrubs, in this case some peas and chenopod's. So I know those landscapes look quite sort of monotonous and a bit barren, so I just thought I'd mention the fact that actually they're really diverse with lots of wildflowers and so on. So that's some examples of some of the species that occur at the wetter end of the spectrum. Some really beautiful things like the delphinium and the dianthus, some of which we recognise from garden flowers. And here's some examples of some of the species in the much drier regions. So despite there not being high cover, there's certainly high biodiversity. I'll also mention too that in the steppe proper, it's actually really familiar botanically. So anyone who knows Victorian grasslands will know many of the dominant genera. So for example, the grasses Poa, Chloris, Elamus, Agrostis and Stipa, all of which are really common in Australian or in Victorian grasslands, are some of the dominant grasses in the steppe, along with some other things. Some of the common forbs like convolvulus and geranium are also really common. But then there's all these completely unfamiliar things to us. So for example, this plant there, Remuria, is a big deal in the drier systems. It's in a family we don't have, the Tamaraceae. Down the bottom right, Ephedra sinica. So this is completely unrelated to anything in the Victorian flora. So that's a little conifer ally that we've got nothing like that. In terms of the wildlife, this is not really relevant to this talk, but I know people will be interested. The fauna are mostly really different to the Australian fauna. And the most striking thing is that there's heaps of burrowing rodents, hares and rabbits. They're some of the most common ones. And that photograph in the middle, it shows a hillside with a whole lot of little green patches on it. And each of those green patches is a marmot colony. So that's there to give you some idea of how common these species are on the steppe. They're everywhere. Whereas the larger animals, of which there are quite a lot of sorts, very rarely seen. So they're much, much less abundant. The other thing to say about this ecosystem is that the steppe has been shaped by pastoralism for thousands of years. And in that photograph there, you can see some Bronze Age graves. So there's lots of signs of human use throughout this system. And really since, since the last ice age, in some ways, this has been modified by humans. There are some cultural elements that have persisted for thousands of years. So there's some really distinctive cultural elements in the steppe. So one being the central place of the horse, another being the central place of the gur or the yurt, and the reliance on animal products. But of course, there's new technology and new things all the time, and you can see the motorcycle and the satellite dish in that photo. The other thing to say is that nowadays, Mongolian products are very much connected to global markets, and this will become an issue in what I talk about later with our project. I'll just dive now into a little bit of the strategies that nomadic herders use to raise their livestock. So in the middle there is just a calendar showing the cycle of the seasons, remembering this is Northern Hemisphere season, so winter's in January. And I'll just take you through it quickly. So if we start in the bottom left, the winter camp is usually the location where people stay the longest. So it's a set location with infrastructure. It's normally got a corral, which is a place that the animals can huddle when the conditions get really harsh, like a blizzard. It's also got fuel and hay and so on. And the animals are often fed with hay during this period because the grass is not often available. It's also notable that the goats are pregnant during this time. So they're really vulnerable during the winter, and that will also become relevant later when I talk about some of the problems. When spring and summer comes on, people are on the move. And so they would normally move from sort of 1 to 4, 5, 6 locations throughout the spring and summer, often for several weeks or even months at a time. And during this time, the baby goats are born, and then the cashmere fibre is combed off the goats and sent to market. Also during the summer, often people go on otor, which is the top right there. So this is a sort of like a long distance migration with lots and lots of short stays, often just with without all of the gur and all the infrastructure. It might just be very short stays. And the purpose of this is to access distant or reserved pastures that haven't been grazed very much to fatten up animals, and also to make social visits and so on. So that's a time of movement. Then the autumn camp is another period of sort of bedding down for a few weeks, in one or a few locations. It's goat breeding time, and it's also time to prepare for the winter. So it's stockpiling hay and fuel and so on. Now, the point about all this is that people can manipulate these strategically to get good outcomes for themselves and the livestock. So the herders are having to respond to lots of things. They need to be mindful of the weather, the condition of the pasture, obviously the condition of their animals, what the market's doing, as well as all of their social engagements. And the sort of the levers they've got to pull, so the strategies they can employ involve quite a few things. So probably the most obvious one is their movement patterns. So they can choose the number and the locations of their camps and how far it is between them. They also need to manage the herd. So this is in terms of the herd numbers. They can sell, buy, or slaughter animals, and they can also will be controlling the gender ratio and thinking about breeding good breed stock and so on. And there's also economic decisions to be made about how much to invest in things like purchasing hay or purchasing minerals and dietary supplements, as well as insurance, veterinary care, and decisions about whether they group together into co-ops, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of strategic decisions that nomads need to make in order to make their living. So often these strategies result in good outcomes. And I guess this is obvious from the fact that these systems have been managed more or less like this for thousands of years. And you get good livelihoods for people, healthy steppe and healthy animals. But sometimes the results are not good. So overgrazing is increasingly occurring. And you can see in the photograph there, really low grass cover and the soil starting to erode away. That's not good. So we've got soil loss, the vegetation's degraded, some of the more palatable species can drop out, wild animals can be excluded, the livestock get unhealthy, and it also leads to economic problems. And here's a couple of examples of what overgrazing looks like. So on the left-hand side there is us measuring some really pretty healthy looking steppe. So we've got high grass biomass, lots of forbs, intact soil. On the right, you can see what overgrazing looks like. So bare earth and soil erosion and compaction. And then sometimes the results are really bad. So the idea of Dud is when these things get most dramatic. So every sort of 5 to 10 years, when you've got the combination of drought in the preceding season and then ice cover or blizzard conditions, a lot of animals can starve from food shortage, and this can be really serious. So for example, in 2002, one of the worst Duds, about 30% of all the livestock in the whole country perished in that winter. And this is obviously disastrous for animal welfare, for people, for the economy, and for the steppe as well. So everyone wants to avoid this. Why does this happen? It's a pretty complicated story, and I'm cutting a long story short here. But basically, when communism came along in the 20s, the herds were nationalised and people's movement patterns were curtailed. So a lot of the traditional patterns of grazing were stopped. 1990s come around after the fall of communism and access to global markets and also high Cashmere prices. We ended up with a bit of a free-for-all, so much less socially regulated grazing patterns and people with a lot of incentive to increase their goat herds. And more livestock equals a more vulnerable system because of the overgrazing problems. This can be seen as a classic version of the tragedy of the commons. So this is the idea that the herds are private, so people own the herds and have self-interest in getting income from them, but the land in Mongolia is all communal, so that this is not on private property. And the idea of the tragedy of the commons is that a common resource is often degraded when individuals are using it and pursuing strategies of self-interest. And that quote there in blue is from one of the classic papers on the tragedy of the commons from 1968, and it mentions that ruin is the destination. But this doesn't have to happen. So down the bottom there, that's a picture of Professor Ostrom, who got the Nobel Prize a while back for going through all the different ways that various social structures, religious beliefs, market conditions, traditions, shame, etc., can control people's behaviour and protect the resource. And so the challenge here is, can we encourage social structures that do this, that prevent this kind of tragedy? And they could be old traditions or they could be new structures. So one way to do this is by using certification or labelling as a tool. So what I've got there is a simple diagram of the production system. So at the bottom, you've got the natural environment, so the steppe. The producer is grazing their goats to extract a resource, and by doing that, they're having an impact on the steppe. The product's bought by a buyer and then sold to a consumer who are paying money to the producer. Now, the idea of a certification scheme is that the consumer is willing to pay more money to help the producer reduce their impacts if they believe that that's where their money is going. So if they believe their money is going to pay for improvements in management or to offset, for example, lower livestock numbers, they might do that. And what that requires is a trust between the producers and the consumers, and that's because they're normally separated. That requires some kind of certification scheme to build the trust in the consumer. The trouble is this can often fail, and probably everyone's aware of failed certification or labelling schemes, and that can happen for lots of reasons. So one could be that the consumers are skeptical of the whole thing and they just won't pay more. Another might be that the certification itself is onerous and people don't adopt it. Another one might be that either the producer or the buyer is fraudulent, or they're engaging in greenwashing so that they're not really controlling the impacts, they're just pocketing the money. And there's also a whole lot of external factors such as predatory pricing from other buyers and so on that can disrupt the scheme. So these things often don't work as intended. So what that means is that the design of certification schemes really matters. So they should be ideally transparent, auditable, and therefore trusted. They should be attractive to the producers and potentially even representative of the wishes of the producers. They need to be efficient, and they need to be mindful of the context of implementation. So, for example, the market conditions. So we were contracted to help our collaborators improve an existing assessment tool. So that's called the Sustainable Cashmere Certification Committee, or S3C, which was developed by the NGO AVSF in collaboration with a whole lot of herders groups in southwest Mongolia. And currently there are 505 families who are certified under this scheme. So what we did, the first thing we did was we developed a new set of measurable audit variables that can drive this metric. And so we did this through a process of lit review, but also some in-depth interviews with herders that Haulo conducted in Mongolia. And these variables need to be things that actually relate to the strategies that the herders are employing. They need to be measurable or auditable. They need to be accepted as valid by the herders, and they should be related to the environmental impacts. Now, you don't need to engage with the details of this, but the key thing here is that there are 3 sets of variables. So some of them are about the context. So this is things like the rainfall in the preceding year, the conditions of the steppe, and so on. So this is like the hand that they're dealt. Then there's stuff about their behaviour and the strategy they actually employ. So these are the things about movement and decisions that they might make. And the last set of variables are the outcomes or the results. So this is about the cashmere product, it's about the survival of their goats, and it's about the vegetation cover when they leave. We also came up with a better definition of what we mean by sustainable. So that's our definition of sustainable grazing. So it's raising livestock in rangelands and making choices which do those 3 things. So there's providing a livelihood for families. So there's an economic aspect to this. It's promoting the long-term health of the rangeland environment, and this includes all aspects of the environment, from the soil to the vegetation, the wild animals, the water resources, etc. And also there's an animal welfare aspect as well. So it means the ongoing well-being of livestock. So if you think about that kind of catastrophe that happens in a dzud, we're trying to guard against all the bad things that happen there. So a sustainable system should be having none of those types of disasters. I'll dive into what we actually did, our method. Now I'm going to skim over a lot of the details of our modelling and data, because if you're really interested in that aspect of it, you can ask me afterwards, but I'll try and skate across the surface and give you enough of an idea about it. So the way we did this was we used the variables that I just described to construct a whole lot of hypothetical herding scenarios, and these ranged from good practice to bad practice to all kinds of practice, and there were 245 of those scenarios. Then we got herders to sit down and look at these scenarios with sustainable practice definition in mind and pass judgment on them. And we got them to give us 2 things. So one was a score ranging between 0 for terrible practice to 100 for best practice for each scenario. And we also got them to tell us whether they thought that particular scenario was worthy of certification in a sustainable labelling scheme. So once we had all the data together, which ended up being just over 2,000 assessments, we were able to make a model from this, and that model can predict the score based on the practice variables, and it can also predict whether or not certification should be granted based on the score. And the idea is, once you've got a model like that, you can apply that as a tool to any real herder or herding family that have been audited under the scheme. The other part of the idea of this is that because most of the judgment is coming from herders, the claim here is that the audit is representative of the kind of collective opinion of other herders. So this is about representation and acceptance amongst the producers. The way we did this was we travelled around southwest Mongolia to 6 regional locations, and we consulted 151 stakeholders. We used local community centres. We provided food and payment for travel, and so people came in from the surrounding districts to meet with us, and AVSF were crucial in making all the phone calls and all the word of mouth stuff that brought all those people in to meet with us. All of the consultation was run by Horlo in Mongolian. She did a fantastic job. It was a huge effort and could not have been done without her. And this graph just shows the types of people that we interviewed and that went into our data set. So you can see in that little inset with the blue and the pink on the right that the vast majority of the people who we interviewed were herders, which means their primary income came from goat herding. So that was about 81%. The rest of the people were scientists or land administrators who also joined our sessions. The bigger graph represents the types of expertise that people self-reported on questionnaires, and you can see that the most common expertise is very much about animal husbandry. So this is like the knowledge set that's represented here is herder knowledge. Okay, so I'm going to jump into some results now. So from that data, we modelled SCORE, like I said before. So the graph on the left-hand side there is a graph showing the correlation or the relationship between the observed scores on the horizontal axis that the herders provided us with. And these are in a holdout set that the model's not trained on, so they're a true test set. And then the vertical axis is the predicted score from the model. So hopefully you can see that there's a positive relationship there. But you can also see there's a lot of noise in the data. So the grey bars underneath represent the range, so the full range of the data. And the striking thing there is that for heaps of those scenarios, people gave us ranges almost from 0 to 100. So there's very little underlying consensus amongst the herders for reasons, or for various reasons, which makes this kind of a hard modelling task. But the other thing is you can see there is a central tendency or a sort of middle ground that is modelable and meaningful there. The right-hand graph shows the relationship between score on the bottom axis and the probability that people said that that particular practice should be certified. So you can see that around about between 42 and 44, depending on which model you use, a score of over that amount is generally warrants certification, and that can be used as a threshold in the scheme. One thing, however, that is worth noting here is that there's quite a lot of evidence in our data set that the economic aspects of the sustainability definition were very much ahead of the environmental concerns. So there's lots of ways we can see this in the data, but this is just kind of one of them. So that graph there shows the relative importance of each variable in the model. And so the ones down the bottom are the most important. So these large values means more important. And you can see I've color-coded them by what kind of variable they are. So the one that's most important is the Cashmere acceptance rate. So that's got to do with production. And you can see that you have to go a long way down before you hit a green bar, which is the ones that are explicitly related to the environment. So that one there is the vegetation on departure. So that's sort of the condition of the steppe that's left behind. So this and a whole lot of other things make us think, well, even though we gave the definition of sustainability that included environmental stuff, a lot of the herders are putting economic benefit ahead of environmental concerns. And this is not surprising given a lot of previous interview work that's been done. Now, talking to our collaborators, this is potentially problematic because it might mean that you're simply certifying situations where there's too much livestock. So what we did to explore this and to guard against that was we produced an alternative version of the model that basically is a filtered model that imposes the value set or the worldview of the certifier and kind of can be played off against the raw opinion of the herders. This is a bit of a long story that I won't go into in detail, but there is a whole lot of data behind this, and some of that actually comes from herder interviews as well. So this is not entirely outside of the herder opinion set. Basically what we did was we found all the instances where really high scores were rewarded to clearly unsustainable practices. So that's basically vegetation cover that is left behind below a collapse threshold. And the collapse threshold was determined from previous work that we've done with other collaborators in Mongolia. And when we did that, we remodeled. So we've now got a full data set and a filtered data set. You can see the model still works. But if you drill into the underlying data, there's some big differences now. So what I'm showing here is the relationship between score and the number of goats in the herd at the end of the season. And these are partial dependence plots, which is basically saying if you look at that variable alone, what's the relationship to score? So on the left-hand side where you've got the full data set, you can see that basically high scores are often rewarded to large goat herds, and goat herds that increase beyond 1,000, there's no score penalty. In the filtered data set, you can see that the larger goat herds are just bobbing around the certification threshold. What that means is that large goat herds don't generally qualify for certification, and in order to qualify, all the other variables such as movement patterns and the condition of the steppe and so on have to be particularly good to warrant certification. And you can see that even in the filtered data set, it's perfectly possible to get high scores. So we're not actually stripping out the high scores. Oh, so that's my last slide. But so what this leaves us with is basically two answers. So what? So we're currently in discussion with the collaborators about how we implement this. So basically, the difference between these two metrics represents the difference between the value sets of the certifier and the herders, and that represents sort of the price premium that needs to be paid to minimize goat grazing. I think I'll leave it there, and that's my last slide. So any questions?
Steve, that was fantastic. Such an interesting story, and an interesting place to go to, and just a fantastic way of integrating ecological knowledge with the local knowledge. So,
but I see I went over time, so I'm sorry about that.
That's all right. We've got a couple of minutes left for questions, so over to Andy. It looks like there's a question there.
We've got one straight off the bat. So Rick's asking, do herders think that the certification scheme improves the management of steppes?
We haven't directly asked them that question, but the fact that, so it's a voluntary scheme, and the fact that in that region over 500 families have signed up for it voluntarily and they've remained in the scheme for now over 5 years suggests that it's got a reasonable level of support. And we certainly had no problem getting people to come and talk to us, and it was quite explicit what we were doing and what they were being involved in. We're making no secret to the fact. So yeah, I think there's a fair bit of support. I'm sure not everyone supports it, but there's quite a bit of support, yeah.
Awesome. And your last point was around a lot of it seemed to be economic and self-interested and motivated in what your results got, but then you had to do another layer of modelling to sort of correct it for the environmental aspect. Do you think after having done this process, you'd use the same rollout in a Victorian context for management and environmental management at the same time?
You could do. I think you either need to do something like what we did where you have kind of a raw and unfiltered version and a filtered version, or you would need to tighten your definition of sustainability in the first place to only focus on the environmental aspects. But that wasn't the desire at the start of this project. We wanted to make sure that we were had a view to the economics and social side of it as well, just sort of quantify that difference.
Awesome. Thank you. Hollis jumped in and answered the question about a specific animal, I believe, or plant. It's Lemnos chinesis in the Mongolian steppe. Is that a familiar species to you?
I don't know what the question was, but yeah, it is. That's one of the dominant grasses. Yeah.
It is. Okay, great.
Yeah.
I wasn't familiar with that at all. So
I can't see the chat from my view here, but
you're all good.
Yeah.
Cool. I'm just waiting for any other questions. Oh yeah, so Debbie's asked, why do you go to Mongolia to offer these type of services? So the question around, I guess, how did that come about, and why is your expertise so sought after?
Oh, so ARI's done a fair bit of work on using stakeholder and expert judgments to sort of integrate with modelling approaches. So that's through both the Melbourne Strategic Assessment Project, but also the SMP work that Matt White has been involved with Jim Thompson and others. And so because of that work, we were asked by our collaborators to join up with what they're doing. So they've got all the local knowledge along with the herders. So we were asked to bring those quantitative skills to this problem.
Awesome. That's really great. I think it's a testament to the skill sets that you guys have, that it is so sought after, and they want you guys involved. There's another, this is just a point from Rick saying the Deeper Economics team is also keen to support and work with you in future as well.
Good. Cool.
I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment, so maybe a few more pop up later on. But I think at this point we're probably ready to go to Andre. And thank you so much again, Steve, for your amazing presentation. It was, yeah, took me from zero to a small level of understanding of the Mongolian ecosystem, which was delightful. Thank you.
Great. So I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Yeah, you're good. And Andre, over to you. Oh, actually, back to you, Lindy. Sorry.
Yep. So yes, thanks, Steve. That was amazing. It's so interesting to see all the photos and the lifestyle over there as well. So now we're going to have quite a shift coming back to Australia, and we're lucky to have Andre Messina, who's a botanist at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Victoria, going to be talking to us about seed and spore banking for plant conservation, and a really important topic for conservation of a lot of our species. So thank you so much, Andre, and over to you.
Pardon me. Thanks, Lindy. Hopefully my voice isn't too croaky today. So I'm going to put on my seed banking hat, which is sort of one of the many roles I have at the gardens, and talk to you all about some of our work going on at the Victorian Conservation Seed Bank, which hopefully this will change. So a few points about the seed bank. So it's been running since 2005, originally set up with support from the Millennium Seed Bank in the UK. So the seed bank itself is housed at the National Herbarium, which is in at the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne. The seed bank here in Victoria isn't running on its own. It's part of a national partnership, of which there's 14 partners. And the general aim of the seed bank here is specifically for conservation of threatened species, particularly those that are endemic in Victoria or classified as rare and threatened. And so the way we're conserving this is through ex situ conservation with having wild collected seed collections. Recently, we've expanded that out from just seeds to also include spore collection. And this has come about since some funding we got through DECA for additional facilities to allow a few new things. And that's sort of the general focus of my talk, is sort of some of the new kit we've got. A bit more background about the seed bank. So on the right there, that's the seed bank itself. It's a very large -20 freezer. So in the bank currently, we've got around about 1,500 taxa across a little over 2,200 collections. And a little over half of the taxa that we've got in the seed bank are classified as rare and threatened. And that represents a little over half of all of the FFG listed species in Victoria. And on the national basis, we've currently got about 80% of species that are classified under the EPBC Act. So a really big focus on those rare and threatened things. And I'll also point out it's not just me in the seed bank. There's a whole team of us now working in the bank. A very brief summary of sort of the process. I'm not going to go into detail on how to seed bank today. I think most of you have probably seen that. But I guess that it's key to note that we're involved with everything from that initial figuring out what we think are priority targets, going out into the field, doing that collecting. The seed's then brought back into our labs where it's dried down. We'll assess those collections and make sure that there's actually seed in them, at which point we then go on to cleaning them right down to just pure seed, at which point we're able to calculate approximately how much seed's there. We now have an X-ray machine which helps us figure out what percentage of that collection is actually viable, so filled. And as well as the actual collecting, we're interested in germinating that seed. So how does it grow? What do you need to do to grow that stored seed? At which point it then eventually ends up in that -20 freezer that I showed earlier. I'm just going to drill into a couple of those sort of spots in that circle just for a bit more detail. In terms of the field collection, so I just really want to highlight that we're not a bulk facility, and we're not there for sort of broad scale revegetation projects. It really is focusing on things that are quite range restricted and rare. So we generally aim for a collection of about 4,000 seeds as a minimum. So that's not a lot, but we try and get a good genetic coverage of any population from that smallish sample. And obviously for a lot of what we're after, the populations in the wild are so small that we quite often don't actually reach that 4,000, because we are wanting to make sure that we do it sustainably and ethically. So we have to limit how much we take, because obviously we don't want to threaten the species that we're trying to conserve through our actions. That would be sort of against the whole point. In terms of the cleaning and quality assessment, so we do actually sort of get that down under the microscope, and we'll remove it to pretty well pure seed, and make sure that there's no insects or anything in there that are going into storage. The other thing that happens at that step is that we'll do viability test or seed fill testing to see what proportion of that collection's filled. In the past, this has been done by taking a subsample of seed, cutting it open, and seeing what percentage of that cut seed was filled. We're now largely able to get around this by our new X-ray machine, which we've recently acquired. And this is a way of looking at that seed's contents without actually cutting it open and destroying the seed. So here we've got a slide with a few different images of different sorts of seeds. Basically what you're looking for is these nice white filled seeds. So they come up nice and white on the slide. You also you'll find there's a range of things that look filled from externally, but they're completely empty inside. So they come up black or shriveled in the X-ray. The other thing that's really neat, sometimes you'll see these seeds that kind of look a bit fuzzy. So these ones down the bottom here, and in the bottom right, you can actually see that the reason why they're looking fuzzy is because they're filled with grubs. So that one's actually got the grub inside it still. So that's a way of figuring out what's going on inside the seeds. And so this is really important in terms of knowing what we're storing, but it's also great in that we're not destroying seed in the process. And it also means that when we set up our germination trials, we're only running that now with seeds that are potentially filled, which makes doing the calculations of germination a lot easier. So getting on to that sort of last couple of steps in the process, before it goes into long-term storage, we do run germination tests. So that's to get some baseline germination data to make sure if we can germinate it before it goes into the freezer. And these experiments are run on agar in petri dishes, and they are run inside these incubation cabinets up on the top left. So these incubation cabinets, you can adjust day and night temperatures and also photo period. And so we've got a range of these incubators now to run different temperatures and day lengths. So we have this baseline data, and then after the seed's gone into storage, every sort of 5 to 10 years, we're able to pull that back out and make sure that what we've got is still viable. So it's really important to have that baseline data. But in theory, the seed that we've stored should be able to last for 100, if not more, years. And the general principle behind that is that once you dry seed down and keep it cool, it sort of slows any activity going on in that seed and sort of makes it metabolize more slowly and should live for longer. So what we're aiming for is a seed moisture of around 5 to 8%. and then it's at that minus 20. So they're the conditions they're stored in that freezer. So the part that I'm not so involved with, but this is work that Meg and Beck are particularly involved in, is some things you get the seed where it grows. That's really easy. But a lot of the species we have in Victoria have dormancy issues that you need to figure out, or very specific germination requirements in order for them to grow, which makes sense. You don't want your seed, growing at the start of winter if it's about to go into snow, things like that. So we have these various cabinets that we can run things at different temperatures. But in other scenarios, or for different species, there's additional dormancy that you need to overcome, and so we're undertaking studies into that. So this example here on this slide is of a study that Beck Miller's been running on Pomaderus. So Pomaderus have a hard seed coat, and so they're typically difficult to get to germinate. So in these two agar slides here, on the left you can see there's no germination. On the right there's lots of germination. Both are running 25 degrees day, 15 degrees night. So it's not the temperature that's changed there, but it's a heat treatment. So the ones on the right have been heat treated before being sown, and so that heat treatment's cracking the seed coat and allowing germination to occur. And so in this example, Pomaderus ferruginea, it's a sort of warm temperate species. So it's that heat treatment's possibly replicating a fire event. But interestingly, in other Pomaderus species, we're finding that heat treatment does nothing. And for things that are growing in alpine environments, what they actually require is a cold stratification rather than a hot. And that cold stratification is probably replicating a cold winter, which I touched on before. And some other work we've been involved with is looking at germination in callistemon. So through these various cabinets, we're able to figure out germination rates at different temperatures to find that optimal temperature range. So here's sort of the various curves of different callistemon species at different temperatures, and you can see there's really no one best temperature. Most species have a different response to others. And the reason this work was undertaken was two of these callistemon species were impacted in the recent bushfires. This was Forester A and Ken Morrisii. They're both really rare, range restricted things, and we had seed in storage, and we wanted to know how to get those to germinate in case any seed or plants was required for reintroduction projects after the fires. But thankfully, it hasn't come to that. They've come back quite well so far, anyway. The other really great new piece of equipment we have is this thermogradient plate, which we've got a photo here of Meg setting up. So this, again, you run this with agar petri dishes in it. And the way that this works is it's kind of like having many of these cabinets all in the one machine. So you've got in the photo on the top right, you can see in the heat image, the bottom left is very cold, and that graduates through to very warm in the top right. So you're simultaneously running a range of different temperatures. And from that, you're able to figure out temperature thresholds for species. So I mean, what's too cold for germination and what's too hot for germination. And so for this example here, you can see, so we've got across the bottom axis the daytime temperature, and across the side axis the nighttime temperature. You can see that at the daytime temperatures of 20 degrees, you're getting very high germination rates at most nighttime temperatures. Pardon me, and likewise, nighttime temperatures of 20 are generally pretty good for this species. But But where this gets interesting is you can see if you were to happen to get a scenario like in the bottom right, where you're getting quite high day temperatures but quite low night temperatures, you're not getting any germination. And so this might mean that if you were to get, in this case, quite an extreme temperature shift with very cold nights and quite warm days, that this species might potentially eventually drop out of an ecosystem. And the species shown here is quite a temperate thing, so it's a quite extreme example, but for some alpine species, we're now running these tests to see at what point do they start not germinating and potentially be unable to persist, and are there any species where that thresholds at a potential new sort of looking forward temperature and might be threatened into the future and potentially may need to be moved or something like that. So it's a really, really exciting new tool we've got. I'm just going to shift over now. I'm probably going to go over time too. I apologise. Into the fern and lycophyte spore storage that we're now involved with. This has been led by Daniel Olsen. I must admit I have very little to do with this, so I probably won't be great at answering questions. So obviously ferns reproduce with spores, so spores don't have a seed coat, so it's quite a different reproducing method and need to be treated quite differently. So in Victoria, we have 123 native fern and lycophyte species. That represents about 4% of our vascular plants. And of that, there's 39 that are classified as rare and threatened. And threatened storage of ferns is quite important. When you think about it, most ferns and lycophytes occur in quite wet places. And so you can see going forward, if we do get increases in temperature and drought and fire, that these wet environments might be threatened. So they're sort of, yeah, really important to start getting into storage. So again, this is looking at long-term storage, and it's quite an exciting project because not many people are doing this yet. So it's really it's lagging behind in the seed bank. So there's about 1,500 seed banks worldwide, and fewer than 10 of those are doing spore collection. So the work we're doing here is really sort of yeah, important stuff. So the spores are quite different, both in how you handle them, but also how you collect them. With seed plants, you generally have a pretty clear fruiting period. With spores, it's not so much. There's not that nice seasonality. So generally, your collection is actually collecting plants from the wild, bringing them back and having them growing in the nursery and waiting for them to produce spores, because it's the best way to get your timing right. So we currently have 40 species in storage. That's from, I think, 2 summers or 2 seasons now. And the overall target's 72 species. So that actual process is simply a matter of, once you've got your fertile fronds, you put it in newspaper and wait for it to shed its spores. You then clean those spores down a bit, leave them at room temperature and humidity for about a week, which is enough to get those spores down to that dry content again, so 5 to 6% moisture. And then rather than going into -20, that they're going into -150, so really, really cold. You can see this this little tube on the bottom left there is a packaged up spore collection, so it's teeny tiny, and then into the -150. So like the plants, the seed plants, there's no point in storing spores if we don't know how to make them grow. So Daniel's also looking into germination of spores. So again, looking at agar and germination cabinets, but also looking at germinating spores on tree fern slabs in a terrarium. And so far he's had some quite good success with that. so now that we've got this minus 150-degree freezer, there's a lot more applications that we'll be looking at into the future with it. So things like bryophyte spores, we're quite interested in getting involved with. Potentially, we might be able to set up a pollen bank, and also setting up for tissue culturing of tricky plants. So tissue culturing potentially bryophytes and fungi, and seed plants that otherwise don't deal with that drying and storage of seed process. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to put up a pretty slide because I haven't had any yet.
Fantastic. Always good to end with a pretty slide. That was really interesting, Andre, and just great to see the technology that's available in terms of, how you can do some of all of this. Yeah, fantastic and really interesting. So I've got some questions, but it looks like Annette's got one, so we'll go over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Lindy. Yeah, Annette's just asked regarding, I guess, your decision that future plants might become threatened under different climate scenarios. And that's wondering if you're able to collect seed spores and test germination on species not listed under legislation, but actually vulnerable to future climate change.
Yeah, we are. So yeah, I'm not. We're not limited to just rare and threatened things. That's very much been the focus. But yeah, now it's really looking at getting, I guess, species that we can see looking forward might be threatened, but also populations. So populations at end of range and things like that, which might be lost into the future.
Awesome, thank you. Talia's asking if you're working with traditional owner corporations or their ranger groups and for the seed collections.
Yep. This is a space that historically we haven't been great with, but we are starting to build relationships in this space. So yeah, there's a couple of groups that we have been involved with, more so probably in the space of training them up, and sort of empowering them to have the skills to do, particularly because I think a lot of those groups are more interested in broad scale revegetation, or specific species that are of interest to them rather than threatened species necessarily. Sometimes that there's overlap there, but not always. So yes is the answer, but there's still lots of work to do there.
Oh, that's good to hear that it's progressing at least. Michael's got a similar question about collaboration. Are you working with other global seed vaults to share spores and seeds that you've collected within Victoria?
Yes. So we're still a member of the Millennium Seed Bank Partnership. So we do duplicate our seed collections. So typically half of what we collect will go to the Millennium Seed Bank in Kew, and that's sort of a backup storage in case our power goes out and we, the freezer defrosts or something like that, that we can then contact them and say, can you please send over the other half of that collection because the building burnt down or whatever unforeseen problem.
Always good to have a backup. Beck's got a very specific question about Grevillea barcellania from the Bunyip State Park. Have you had any luck in germinating that specific species? I'd
have to get back to you on that one.
Fair
we
enough.
Do have collections of it, and we've been doing a lot more Grevillea collection of late. Some have been straightforward to germinate and others have not, and I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
That's all good. I think it was a very specific question. I thought I'd try my luck. Yeah, Beck did too. Scott's asked, have you looked at the storage of cultured tissues?
I haven't personally, but it's certainly something that we're going to start getting more involved with, I think. We haven't had many sort of proper scientists, if you will, involved in the project. I don't know how to tissue culture, but I know that Beck and Alistair and others can, and we now have good facilities to do that. So watch this space.
That's great. I think that's an invitation, Scott, to get in touch with Andre. I've got another one around the results of, I guess, those germination trials. Are they being published in publicly accessible sort of documents or papers?
So that the work on Pomaderus is ongoing but wrapping up, and I think the intention is that Beck will get that published in a scientific journal somewhere. But as yet, I don't think we've had any of that made available. With that said, we've got a portal on the ALA. The Australian Seed Bank Partnership has a portal on the ALA, and if you log into that, you don't need to be a member or anything to access it, but the results of germination trials can appear on that. So if there's a species that you're interested in seeing what germination trials people have tried, the Australian Seed Bank Partnership ALA on Atlas of Living Australia portal is a good spot to go and have a look.
Awesome. That's a really good resource. I hope I've got the right link and just thrown it in chat for you. I think we've got
it's actually getting a facelift, so it'll look a bit different.
Perfect. Good time to get people interested anyway. Sean's asked a question about the seedlings that you grow from those germination tests. Do they end up with a home, or are they discarded? What happens to them?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's a bit problematic because you have seedlings of these quite rare plants generated in these trials. A lot of it ultimately ends up getting grown at the gardens, either at Melbourne or Cranbourne. Where we have big numbers of seedlings, we will approach DECA or Parks or other groups, Melbourne Water, for instance, to see if they're interested. We're more than happy to distribute them. Quite often you'll end up with maybe 3 seedlings, which is sort of more hassle for anyone than it's worth to try and get out. But where we're able to line up that there's someone who's interested in receiving them, and it then puts the onus on them. They have to actually, pay to get them into the ground and water them and things like that. But yeah, ultimately we do like them to go somewhere, but quite often they do end up sort of on display in the gardens. And some of them actually get squashed or pressed. So we actually have a big collection of seedlings now at the herbarium here. So we have pressed plant collections. We also get in now this collection of seedlings, which potentially will be really helpful, and it was helpful for bushfire post-fire work, where you're looking at seedlings and identifying seedlings. So they're sort of being used as an identification tool as well. I hope that answered that one.
I think that's a really good response. I have one last question, but I think I might go to it just because it's, I think, something that explains your profile pic used in this seminar series. Brad's asking, are there any stories about extreme seed collection, i.e. this rock climbing up a cliff face?
Yeah, I wasn't going to talk about that today. I thought you'd all be sick of that. We cover all of Victoria, and so yeah, we do get to travel around a bit. And that photo was taken from a week of rafting down the Snowy River with rafting guides, which was pretty nice way of seeing the Snowy.
All right. Well, maybe if you've spoken about it a lot, maybe someone can find that presentation previously somewhere online and catch up as well. Thank you so much, Andre. I'm just going to finish up before I throw it back to Lindy. Our next ARI seminar will be on the 22nd of May. We'll be having Dr. Graham Colson talking about kangaroo management and Dr. Matthew Rees speaking about feral cat and fox interactions. So hopefully see you all there, and over to you, Lindy.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Steve and Andre, so much for really interesting and diverse presentations. So, and thank you all for joining us online for another fascinating ARI seminar. So we hope to see you all next time. Bye.